Imagine this. It is the winter of 1778, and New York City is no longer an American city. British soldiers march through its streets in perfect lines. Red-coated sentries stand outside churches, warehouses, taverns, printing offices, and government buildings. Loyalist merchants do business openly with the King's army. British officers dine in warm rooms, drink imported wine, read newspapers, write orders, and plan the next campaign from the safest headquarters they believe they have in North America. Outside the city, warships crowd the harbor. Their black hulls sit low in the water like floating fortresses. Their cannons point toward the rivers, toward the docks, toward the shore, toward any rebel foolish enough to think he can challenge the Royal Navy in its own waters. From New York, the British can strike almost anywhere. They can move north up the Hudson, they can threaten the Highlands, they can raid Connecticut, they can launch attacks into New Jersey, they can watch Long Island, they can send troops by sea faster than Washington can move men by road. They can plan in comfort while the Continental Army struggles in mud, hunger, sickness, and uncertainty. And George Washington knows the truth. If he cannot see inside New York, he is fighting blind. He does not know which ships are preparing to sail. He does not know which regiments are being moved. He does not know whether the British are preparing to attack his army, his supply lines, his allies, or the towns still supporting the revolution. Every rumor could be false. Every silence could be dangerous. Every British movement could be the beginning of a trap. One wrong march and Washington's army could be cut off. One missed warning and the revolution could lose its last chance. One secret British plan, if discovered too late, could finish what bayonets, hunger, disease, and defeat had not yet managed to do. The British have the city. They have the navy. They have professional soldiers. They have loyalist informants. They have prisons, patrols, spies, money, ships, and the full weight of the most powerful empire on earth. Washington has almost none of that. But he is about to build something the British never see coming. Not a new army, not a new fort, not a new cannon. A hidden machine. A machine made of farmers, merchants, tavern keepers, riders, boatmen, false names, secret numbers, invisible ink, laundry signals, and scraps of paper passed through enemy territory. It will operate under the noses of British officers for years. It will move through occupied New York, across Long Island, over dangerous water, through farms, taverns, coves, back roads, and military camps, until British secrets land in George Washington's hands. And the strangest part is this. The people who built it were not famous generals. They were not professional spies. They were not masked assassins, slipping through alleyways with daggers under their coats. Most of them looked exactly like the kind of people the British would never think to fear. A farmer, a merchant, a courier, a whaleboat captain, a woman hanging laundry, a young cavalry officer who understood that courage alone would not win a war. The British were fighting the war they could see. Washington was learning how to fight the war they could not. This is the story of the spy ring Britain never saw coming. To understand why Washington needed this network so badly, you have to go back to the disaster that taught him one of the hardest lessons of the American Revolution. In 1776, Washington tried to defend New York. It was supposed to be one of the most important stands of the war. New York was valuable. It had a great harbor. It connected waterways, roads, trade routes, and military positions. If the British controlled it, they would have a base from which they could divide the colonies, support loyalists, and choke the rebellion. Washington knew he had to try to hold it. But the British arrived with overwhelming force. Ships filled the harbor. Soldiers landed in huge numbers. British and Hessian troops poured onto Staten Island. The King's army was disciplined, experienced, and confident. They had crossed the Atlantic to crush a rebellion, and New York looked like the perfect place to do it. Washington had brave men. He had officers who wanted to prove themselves. He had militia and Continental soldiers willing to stand for independence. But he did not have what he needed most. He did not have reliable intelligence. That mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The British did not simply attack where Washington expected them. They maneuvered, they used the Navy. They landed troops where American defenses were weak. They threatened one point, moved toward another, and forced Washington to guess. And when Washington guessed wrong, the results were brutal. At Long Island, the British executed a devastating flanking movement. American troops were pushed back, units were battered, the Continental Army barely escaped destruction. Washington had to evacuate his men across the East River in the fog, slipping away from disaster by the thinnest margin imaginable. Then Manhattan became impossible to hold. The British took New York City. Washington retreated north, then west, then across New Jersey. His army shrank, men deserted, enlistments expired, supplies disappeared. The revolution, which had looked bold and defiant in July, looked almost dead by December. And in the middle of that nightmare, Washington made one of his earliest attempts at espionage. A young officer named Nathan Hale volunteered to go behind British lines. Hale was brave, he was educated, he was patriotic, he believed in the cause, he had the kind of courage that makes a man step forward when everyone else stays silent. But courage is not the same thing as tradecraft. Hale crossed into British-controlled territory, disguised as a schoolteacher. He tried to gather information, but he had no real network, no secure system of communication, no deep cover, no reliable escape route, no chain of support, no one inside the city carefully feeding him information piece by piece. He was captured, and he was hanged as a spy. The message could not have been clearer. Bravery was not enough. A single man walking into enemy territory with a disguise and good intentions was not an intelligence operation. It was a death sentence. Washington remembered that. He remembered the cost of bad information. He remembered the danger of sending a man behind enemy lines without a system strong enough to keep him alive. He remembered what it felt like to fight an enemy whose plans he could not see until they were already in motion. And Washington was a man who learned. That may have been one of his greatest strengths. He lost battles, he made mistakes, he retreated again and again. But he learned from disaster in a way many commanders do not. He did not pretend failure had nothing to teach him. He studied it, he absorbed it, he changed. By 1778, the war had entered a new and dangerous phase. The Continental Army had survived Valley Forge, it had not collapsed in the snow. France had recognized American independence and was moving openly toward alliance. The war was no longer just a rebellion inside the British Empire. It was becoming part of a global struggle between empires. That made British-controlled New York even more important. New York was the British nerve center. Troops moved through it, ships sailed from it, officers planned inside it, loyalists gathered there, prisoners were held there, supplies were stored there, rumors from across the 12,000 passed through its docks and drawing rooms. If Washington could see into New York, he could see into the British war effort. If he could not, he would have to keep guessing. And guessing was how armies died. So in late 1778, Washington turned to a young officer named Benjamin Tallmadge. Tallmadge was not the most famous man in the Continental Army. He was not a household name like Washington. He was not a glamorous foreign volunteer like Lafayette. He was not a battlefield legend. He was young, disciplined, intelligent, and careful. That was exactly what Washington needed. Tallmadge had grown up in Setauket, on the north shore of Long Island. He knew the region, he knew the roads, he knew the coves, farms, villages, and family networks that stretched across the island. He understood that Long Island was not just territory on a map. It was a living world of neighbors, loyalties, fears, grudges, and secrets. And that mattered, because Long Island was occupied. British troops and loyalist forces moved through it. Families were divided. Some people supported independence, some remained loyal to the crown, some simply wanted to survive. A less word in the wrong tavern could ruin a man. A neighbor could report a neighbor. A suspicious ride could be noticed, a letter could be searched, a name could be whispered to. The wrong officer. This was the world Tallmadge had to work inside. Washington gave him a mission that sounded almost impossible. Build a spy ring that could reach into New York City, collect British secrets, move them through occupied territory, and deliver them to the Continental Army without being destroyed. Not once. Not for one dramatic mission. Again and again. For as long as the war required. That was the real challenge. Anyone can take one desperate risk. A real intelligence network has to survive repetition. The same road, the same names, the same villages, the same harbor crossings, the same danger over and over until caution becomes the only thing keeping everyone alive. Pas Talmadge understood something important from the beginning. He could not recruit men who wanted fame. Fame was dangerous. He could not recruit men who liked to talk. Talk was deadly. He could not recruit men who imagined spying as glory. Glory gets people hanged. He needed ordinary people who could disappear into ordinary life. That was the first great insight of the Culper Ring. The best spy is not always the man who looks mysterious. Sometimes the best spy is the man nobody bothers to notice. The first major link in the chain was Abraham Woodhull. Woodhull was a farmer from Setauket. He was not the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a legend. He was not a professional soldier. He was not a wealthy statesman. He was with someone who would make British officers immediately nervous. That made him useful. Woodhull could move through Long Island with believable reasons. He had family connections. He knew the local landscape. He understood which routes were dangerous, which people could be trusted, which questions would sound natural, and which questions would get a man killed. But Woodhull was not fearless. And that is important, because too many spy stories make courage look like the absence of fear. Woodhull was afraid. He had every reason to be. He knew what the British did to spies. Everyone knew. Nathan Hale's execution was not some forgotten rumor. It was a warning. A spy was not treated like a captured officer. A spy as not guaranteed the protections of a soldier. A spy could be hanged. Woodhull understood that every letter he handled could become evidence. Every trip could be questioned. Every neighbor could be a threat. Every British patrol could be the last he ever saw. His fear did not make him weak. It made him careful. And in espionage, careful is often more valuable than brave. Woodhull took the code name Samuel Culper. That name would eventually give the entire network its identity. But Woodhull alone could not see deeply enough into New York. He was valuable, but the city itself needed eyes. Someone had to be inside the place where British officers talked, where loyalists gathered, where shipping news moved, where plans became rumors before they became orders. That is where Robert Townsend entered the story. Townsend may have been one of the most valuable people in the entire network. He was a merchant. He had connections in New York City. He moved through spaces where information naturally collected. Businessmen heard things, writers heard things, printers heard things, customers talked, officers complained, loyalists boasted. News arrived in fragments before it became official. Townsend did not need to break into a headquarters at midnight. He needed to listen. That sounds simple. It was not. Listening inside an occupied city is dangerous because every conversation has two meanings. One meaning is what people say. The other is what they reveal without knowing it. A ship being repaired may mean a campaign is coming. A sudden demand for wagons may mean troops are moving. Officers speaking carelessly may reveal where they expect trouble. A new paper notice may hide military significance. A loyalist who thinks he is gossiping may be handing over the outline of a British plan. Townsend had to collect fragments. Not dramatic confessions. Fragments. A name here. A date there. A regiment mentioned in passing. A ship preparing. A rumor repeated by too many people to ignore. Then those fragments had to leave the city. And that was the next problem. Information inside New York was useless if it stayed inside New York. A secret that does not move is not intelligence. So the ring needed couriers. Austin Rowe became one of them. Rowe was a tavern keeper and courier. He traveled between Long Island and New York under the cover of ordinary business. That cover mattered. A man riding for no reason is suspicious. Pies. A man riding because he has business to conduct is just another civilian trying to survive wartime. On paper, Rowe could look like a man buying supplies, taking orders, settling accounts, or visiting contacts. In reality, he was a moving piece of an intelligence machine. He could carry messages out of New York. He could move information toward Long Island. He could make the road itself part of the network. But a road could only take the message so far. Eventually, the intelligence had to cross water. That is where Caleb Brewster came in. Brewster was a whaleboat captain, bold, tough, and dangerous in a more obvious way than some of the others. He knew the waters of Long Island Sound. He knew how to move by boat, how to read weather, how to use darkness, how to approach a shore, and how to get away before the enemy understood what had happened. His job was terrifying. A rider might pass as a civilian. A boat crossing the Sound at the wrong time could look like exactly what it was. British ships patrolled the waters. Loyalists watched the shores. Weather could turn a secret mission into a drowning. A single interception could expose names, routes, papers, and the entire chain of communication. Brewster had to make the secret move across open water. That required nerve. Not the kind of theatrical courage that looks good in a painting. The practical courage of a man rowing into darkness with British power all around him. Then there was Anna Strong. Her role sits somewhere between documented history, local tradition, and the kind of story that survives because it is too perfect to disappear. According to tradition, she helped signal Brewster using laundry on a clothesline. A black petticoat could mean a message was ready. Handkerchiefs could indicate which cove Brewster should use. Think about how brilliant that is. No lantern in a tower. No dramatic coded flag. No suspicious messenger galloping through a village. Just laundry. The most ordinary thing in the world. A woman hanging clothes in the wind. A boatman watching from the water. A secret hidden inside domestic routine. That is the kind of detail that explains why the Culper ring worked. It did not always hide by becoming invisible. It hid by becoming ordinary. A farmer going about his business. A merchant writing letters. A tavern keeper riding a familiar road. A boatman crossing water he knew well. A woman hanging laundry. The British could search for spies and still miss the system because the system looked like life. And all of these people were connected by Benjamin Tallmadge. Tallmadge did not just recruit a few brave civilians and hope the plan worked. He built structure. He created layers. He used code names. He developed a numerical code. He separated identities. He tried to make sure that one captured person could not destroy everyone. That was the difference between a doomed mission and a surviving network. The first rule was simple. Do not use real names. Tallmadge became John Bolton. Woodhull became Samuel Culper. Townsend became Samuel Culper Jr. Washington himself could appear as a number. New York could be a number. Places could be numbers. People could be numbers. Actions could be numbers. A letter that mentioned names openly was dangerous. A letter that transformed those names into numbers was harder to understand. A British officer who intercepted such a letter MiG-HT suspect something, but suspicion was not the same as knowledge. And knowledge was what the British needed. Without the codebook, a message could become a wall. But even coded writing had a problem. It looked suspicious. If a British patrol found a civilian carrying pages full of strange numbers, that civilian would have a very bad day. So the ring used something even more subtle. Invisible ink. Washington called it white ink. It had been developed by James J., a doctor and chemist. It allowed messages to be written in a way that did not appear unless treated properly. A letter could look harmless. A blank space could hide military intel. Legends. A page that seemed empty in the important places could contain the thing Washington needed most. Imagine being a British officer holding one of those letters. You look at the paper. You see ordinary writing. Maybe business. Maybe family. maybe dull civilian concerns that seem beneath the attention of an empire. You do not see the hidden message. You do not see the troop report. You do not see the warning. You do not see Washington's eyes staring back at you from the blank space on the page. That was the power of the system. It did not depend on one trick. It layered protections, false names, numbers, invisible ink, trusted couriers, water crossings, ordinary occupations, compartmentalized knowledge. No one had to know everything. That last part may have saved the ring. Washington himself did not always know the true identities of the people serving him inside the network. That sounds strange until you understand the logic. What Washington did not know, he could not accidentally reveal. If his papers were captured, they could not expose names that were never written there. If one courier was stopped, he might not know every source. If one member was questioned, he might not be able to destroy the whole chain. The ring survived because it behaved like a living organism. If one part was threatened, the rest could still move. This was not the amateur spying that had gotten Nathan Hale killed. This was a system built by men who had learned that secrecy is not one decision. Secrecy is a discipline. It has to be practiced. It has to be repeated. It has to become boring. And that is exactly what made it dangerous. The culpers were not dangerous because they looked like legends. They were dangerous because they did their work again and again until British secrets began to leak out of the most important occupied city in America. Messages moved from Townsend to Row, from Row toward Woodhull, from Woodhull through signals and routes, from Long Island to Brewster, across the Sound, to Tallmadge, to Washington. A secret whispered in New York could reach the commander of the Continental Army, and the British could not stop it because they did not fully understand the shape of the thing they were fighting. This is where the story becomes more important than a simple spy tale. The Culper Ring reveals something the British never fully solved about the American Revolution. They could occupy land without controlling every person on it. They could hold a city without controlling every conversation inside it. They could patrol roads without knowing which ordinary ride mattered. They could command a harbor without seeing every message that crossed it. They could dominate the visible world and still lose information through the cracks. That is terrifying for any army, because armies are built to defeat visible enemies. They can bombard a fort. They can storm a hill. They can occupy a town. They can blockade a harbor. They can hang a captured spy. But how do you fight a clothesline? How do you arrest a blank space on a page? How do you know which merchant is just selling goods and which merchant is memorizing your movements? How do you stop a farmer from noticing too much? How do you stop a tavern keeper from riding a familiar road? How do you stop a boatman from understanding water better than your patrols do? The British had the power to punish spies. But first, they had to find them. And for years they failed. That does not mean the work was easy. Every step of the network carried risk. A letter could be dropped. A horse could be stopped. A British officer could ask the wrong question. A loyalist neighbor could become suspicious. A courier could be searched. A boat could be intercepted. A hidden message could be discovered. A codebook could fall into enemy hands. One mistake could turn the entire ring into a list of names for a gallows. The people in this network were not playing at danger. They were living inside it. Abraham Woodhull felt that danger constantly. He knew he was exposed. He knew that Long Island was filled with eyes. He worried about being discovered. He understood that if the British found out what he was doing, his life could end quickly and publicly. That fear shaped him. At times, Woodhull hesitated. At times, he complained about the danger. At times, he wanted better protection, better methods, more care from the men above him. And he was right. A spy who demands caution is not a coward. He is a professional, even if nobody has given him that title. Robert Townsend was different. He worked in a world where the danger was quieter. New York City did not threaten him with open fields and water crossings every day. It threatened him with conversation, with performance, with the need to appear normal. That may be even harder. A man running through the woods knows he is in danger. A man sitting in a room full of British sympathizers has to remember he is in danger while pretending he is not. Townsend had to listen without looking hungry for information. He had to ask questions without seeming curious. He had to remember details without writing them too soon. He had to live among people who would have destroyed him if they knew what he was doing. And he did it so quietly that his identity as Samuel Culper Jr. remained hidden for generations after the war. That may be the perfect ending for a successful spy. No dramatic reveal, no speech, no parade, just silence. Austin Roe had a different kind of risk. He had to move. Movement creates patterns. Patterns create suspicion. Suspicion invites searches. Every trip had to make sense. Every route had to look normal. Every excuse had to sound like business, not rebellion. A courier is vulnerable because he is the physical link between worlds. If the message stays in New York, it is useless. If the courier is caught, it may be fatal. So Roe had to be ordinary and bold at the same time. That is not easy. Caleb Brewster's danger was more physical. He moved across water where there was no crowd to hide in, no tavern cover, no civilian street. No easy explanation if the wrong patrol appeared. Only darkness, water, oars, weather, and the hope that he would reach the right shore before the British understood what was happening. A boatman carrying intelligence is a fragile thing. One cannon shot, one interception, one storm, one wrong landing. The entire chain could break. Anna Strong, if the laundry tradition is true, represents another kind of courage entirely. The courage of making danger look harmless. A soldier might notice a man with a musket. He might notice a rider in a hurry. He might notice a suspicious boat near shore. But laundry? Laundry belongs to the background of life. That is why the story has lasted. Because it captures the soul of the Culper ring better than almost any other detail. The network survived by hiding inside the ordinary. And Talmadge had to manage all of it. He had to judge people. He had to protect identities. He had to receive intelligence, decode it, decide what mattered, and send it upward. He had to keep Washington informed without exposing the people who made that information possible. Prestival. Talmadge was not just a messenger. He was the architect of an intelligence system. And Washington trusted him with one of the most sensitive jobs in the war. That trust mattered because Washington had become one of the most intelligence-minded commanders of the Revolution. He was not always the best tactician on a battlefield. He was no Popland, a man who won every fight. In fact, he lost many of them. But Washington understood survival. And survival required knowledge. He wanted reports. He wanted sources protected. He wanted money spent on intelligence when necessary. He understood that a commander who only learns the enemy's plan after the enemy begins moving is already too late. The Culper ring became one of the tools that allowed him to stop being blind. And slowly, quietly, the network began to produce results. The messages were not always dramatic. That is another important point. Real intelligence does not always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it is a list of ships, a rumor of troop movement, a note about supplies, a warning that an expedition may be forming, a clue that a raid is being planned, a piece of financial sabotage, a detail that means nothing until placed beside another detail. Hollywood wants every spy message to say, "The attack begins at dawn." Real war is messier. A commander receives fragments. Then he has to decide which fragments matter. That is what Washington had to do. The Culpers could not give him certainty every time. They gave him visibility. And visibility was precious. One of the most important moments came in 1780, after French forces arrived at Newport, Rhode Island. This was a turning point in the war. For years, the Americans had needed serious help. They needed money, supplies, ships, troops, and international legitimacy. France had recognized American independence, but the arrival of French troops made the alliance physical. Real soldiers had crossed the ocean. Real power was now on American soil. But that created a terrifying danger. Newly arrived forces are vulnerable. They have just crossed the Atlantic. They need to unload. They need supplies. They need time to coordinate. They need to understand the local situation. They need to link up with American plans. If the British could strike them quickly, the alliance might be humiliated before it ever reshaped the war. British commanders considered action against the French position. That could have been disastrous. If the French were badly damaged soon after landing, the psychological blow might have been enormous. American morale could suffer. French confidence could weaken. British leaders could claim that foreign intervention had failed. The Culper Network helped Washington learn of the danger, and Washington responded with pressure of his own. He threatened New York. That mattered, because Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander, could not simply sail away if Washington might attack his base. New York was too important. It was the center of British power in the region. Losing control there, or even risking serious disruption there, was unacceptable. So the British attack on Newport did not unfold the way it might have. The French survived their vulnerable opening. That survival mattered, because those French forces and the broader alliance they represented would eventually help make Yorktown possible. Now be careful here. The Culper Ring did not single-handedly save the French army. History is rarely that simple. But it helped Washington see danger early enough to act. And in war, acting early can be the difference between strategy and disaster. That is what intelligence does. It turns time into a weapon. A second kind of threat came not from soldiers but from money. That sounds less dramatic, but it could be just as dangerous. The American Revolution was not only fought with muskets, it was fought with credit, paper currency, supply contracts, promises, and the fragile belief that the new American cause could actually function. The continental currency was already under pressure. Inflation was a constant problem. Soldiers complained. Suppliers doubted. Congress struggled to finance the war. The British understood that if they could attack American money, they could attack the revolution itself. A counterfeit currency operation could do enormous damage. Fake paper money, spread widely enough, could destroy trust. If people believed continental money was worthless, they might refuse to sell supplies. Soldiers might lose faith in their pay. Congress might look weaker than ever. A rebellion that could not feed, clothe, or pay its army could collapse without one final battlefield defeat. The Culper Ring helped expose British counterfeiting efforts. Again, no glorious cavalry charge. No dramatic bayonet attack. No cannon smoke. Just information. A warning carried out of the enemy's world before the damage became unstoppable. This is why the hidden war mattered. Not because every secret changed the entire conflict by itself, but because each secret gave Washington one more chance to avoid blindness. And blindness was deadly. The British wanted the Americans reacting late. Washington wanted to react early. The Culpers helped him do that. They gave him a few more hours, a few more days, a few more clues, a few more chances to make the right decision before the British made it impossible. And that is why the ring became so dangerous. It did not overpower Britain. It made Britain less certain. Every British plan formed in New York had a chance of leaking. Every movement might be watched. Every careless conversation could travel farther than expected. Every officer who thought he was speaking among friends might be speaking near Washington's invisible ears. That is the humiliation hidden inside the story. New York was supposed to be the British stronghold. The city was theirs. The harbor was theirs. The headquarters was theirs. The newspapers, prisons, docks, warehouses, and streets were under their power. But information was escaping anyway. And it was escaping through the kinds of people an empire often underestimates. The empire saw uniforms. Washington saw civilians. The empire saw occupied territory. Washington saw routes. The empire saw a city it controlled. Washington saw a place that could be listened to. This is one of the great patterns of the American Revolution. The British could win conventional advantages and still fail to master the human terrain. They could defeat armies and still face resistance. They could hold cities and still lose the countryside. They could punish rebels and still fail to identify the quiet ones. They could command from headquarters and still be watched from inside the world they thought they owned. The Culper Ring was not just a spy network. It was a reminder that occupation is not control. Control requires more than soldiers in the street. It requires knowing what people say when the soldiers leave the room. It requires knowing which civilian is harmless and which one is listening. It requires knowing when a blank page is not blank. The British never fully solved that. And the network kept operating. For years. That is the part that should stop you. Not one lucky mission. Not one brave ride. Not one dramatic escape. Years. Year after year. Through changing campaigns, shifting dangers, suspicion, fear, weather, patrols, personal exhaustion, and the constant possibility that one mistake could kill everyone. The ring survived. Its members were never fully unmasked by the British. That is extraordinary. A battlefield victory can happen in an afternoon. A spy network has to win every day. Every day it is not discovered, it wins. Every letter delivered is a win. Every source protected is a win. Every message decoded is a win. Every ordinary action that passes unnoticed is a win. And because those wins are quiet, they are easy for history to forget. That is why the Culper story feels different from a battle. There is no single moment where the smoke clears and everyone knows who won. There is no flag captured in front of cheering soldiers. No surrender ceremony. No painting of Anna Strong's clothesline changing the war. No marble statue of Austin Roe riding under suspicion. No famous schoolbook image of Robert Townsend listening in a city that would have killed him if it knew who he was. Espionage does not reward its heroes with noise. It rewards them with survival. If you do the job badly, everyone hears about it because you are caught. If you do the job well, almost no one hears about it at all. That is the strange greatness of the Culper Ring. Its silence is part of its success. And yet the story does not end with the delivery of messages. It also changes how we should understand Washington. The popular image of Washington is often simple. The marble man, the general on horseback, the face on the currency, the commander crossing the Delaware, the father of a country. But the real Washington was not a statue. He was a commander under terrible pressure, often outnumbered, often uncertain, often forced to make decisions with incomplete information. He knew the revolution could die. He watched men freeze. He watched enlistments expire. He watched Congress struggle. He watched officers quarrel. He watched the British hold cities he could not retake. And through all of that, he learned that winning did not always mean attacking. Sometimes winning meant not being trapped. Sometimes it meant surviving until the enemy made a mistake. Sometimes it meant protecting an ally. Sometimes it meant knowing just enough to avoid disaster. The Culper Ring fit Washington's real genius. He was not a reckless gambler chasing glory. He was a survivor who learned how to preserve the possibility of victory, and intelligence was essential to that. This also explains why the American Revolution was so difficult for Britain. The British were not fighting one problem. They were fighting many problems at once. They had to fight Washington's army. They had to control occupied cities. They had to support loyalists. They had to protect supply lines. They had to coordinate across the Atlantic. They had to respond to France. They had to deal with Spain. They had to manage naval commitments around the world. They had to guess where the rebellion was weakest. And while they were doing all of that, their headquarters in New York was leaking secrets to the man they were trying to destroy. That does not mean every British officer was incompetent. They were not. Many were experienced. Many were intelligent. The British Army was powerful for a reason. The Royal Navy was feared for a reason. The Empire had enormous resources. But power creates blind spots. A great empire often expects danger to look like an army, a flag, a fort, a battlefield, a rebel column marching in the open. The culpers did not look like that. They looked like background. And background is hard to fight. That is why ordinary people matter so much in this story. A revolution is not only made by the men whose names are printed in large letters. It is made by people carrying messages no one is supposed to read. People who take risks no one is supposed to know about. People who do not stand at the front of the painting, but without whom the scene might never have happened. Abraham Woodhull did not need to become a legend to matter. Robert Townsend did not need public fame to matter. Austin Roe did not need a statue to matter. Caleb Brewster did not need every schoolchild to know his name to matter. Anna Strong did not need certainty in every detail of her legend to represent something real about civilian courage. Talmadge did not need to become the most famous officer in the army to build one of its most important hidden systems. And Washington did not need to know every name to understand their value. That may be one of the most powerful things about the ring. It was built on trust between people who often could not fully know each other. Townsend had to trust that his intelligence would be handled carefully. Woodhull had to trust that his identity would be protected. Roe had to trust that the road would not betray him. Brewster had to trust the signal and the shore. Talmadge had to trust sources he could not always control. Washington had to trust reports from people hidden behind code names and numbers. Trust is difficult in war. Trust is even harder in espionage, because one liar can ruin everything. One traitor can kill everyone. And the American Revolution had traitors. The most famous was Benedict Arnold. Arnold had once been one of the most talented fighting generals in the American cause. He had shown courage, he had suffered wounds, he had played major roles in important campaigns for U.S. He had reasons to feel underappreciated and angry. Then he betrayed the revolution. His plot with British Major John Andre shocked the American cause and reminded everyone how dangerous the hidden war could be. Talmadge himself would become connected to the handling of Andre after Andre's capture. That episode was not the same thing as the Culper Ring's daily work, but it belonged to the same shadow world. False papers, secret meetings, hidden identities, messages, codes, trust, treason. The revolution was not only a clash between armies, it was a contest of information and loyalty. And every person in the Culper network knew what betrayal could mean. If someone talked, people died. If someone switched sides, the chain broke. If someone got careless, the British would not need to win a battle to destroy the ring. They would only need one name. That makes the ring's survival even more impressive, because fear does not only come from the enemy, it comes from uncertainty. Can this person be trusted? Was that rider followed? Did that officer notice something? Did the message arrive? Why is the reply late? Has someone been arrested? Has someone confessed? Is the whole thing already compromised and nobody knows yet? That is the psychological battlefield of espionage. It is not loud. It is exhausting. It eats at people. A soldier in battle may face terror for hours. A spy may face dread for years. And the culpers kept going. By 1781, the war moved toward its final decisive act. British General Cornwallis was in Virginia. Washington and the French commander Rochambeau saw an opportunity. French naval power under de Grasse created the chance to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. American and French forces began a movement that would become one of the most important strategic marches of the entire war. Washington had to keep British commanders uncertain. For a long time, New York appeared to remain the possible target. That mattered. If the British fully understood Washington's intentions too early, they might react differently. They might reinforce Cornwallis. They might disrupt the movement south. They might change the timing. They might escape the trap. Secrecy and deception were essential. This was not exactly the Culper Ring acting alone. Yorktown required many forces, many decisions, and many conditions. French ships had to be in the right place. Armies had to move. Cornwallis had to remain vulnerable. Coordination had to work across distance, language, politics, and military culture. But Washington's broader intelligence habits were part of the world that made such a campaign possible. He understood concealment. He understood misdirection. He understood that what the enemy believes can matter almost as much as what the enemy sees. The commander who had been humiliated by uncertainty in New York in 1776 had become a commander who knew how to use uncertainty against the British. That is the deeper arc of this story. Washington began the war needing to learn how not to be blind. By the end, he knew how to blind the enemy. And when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, the visible war finally produced its great image. British troops marching out, drums beating, flags lowered, an empire forced to accept that the rebellion it had tried to crush was no longer something it could simply destroy. That moment belongs to armies, to soldiers, to engineers digging trenches, to artillerymen firing siege guns, to French sailors controlling the Chesapeake, to commanders making bold decisions. But behind that loud final scene were years of quiet acts that helped keep the revolution alive long enough to reach it. A farmer taking a risk, a merchant listening, a rider carrying a hidden message, a boatman crossing dangerous water, a woman signaling from a clothesline, an officer decoding numbers, a commander reading intelligence by candlelight, trying to decide whether the next move could save or doom the cause. The surrender at Yorktown was visible. The hidden war that helped make survival possible was not. After the war, the Culper Ring faded back into obscurity. That was fitting. Some members returned to ordinary life. Some identities remained hidden or uncertain for a very long time. The story did not immediately become one of the central myths of the Revolution. It was too quiet, too secret, too dependent on coded letters, fragments, local memory, and papers that many people never saw. America built its public memory around louder things: declarations, crossings, winters, battles, surrenders, founders, flags. But the war also belonged to people who could not be publicly thanked while they were doing the work. That is the cruel bargain of espionage. If you fail, you may be famous for a day before you die. If you succeed, nobody may know what you did for a century. Robert Townsend's identity as Samuel Culper Jr. was not widely known for generations. That is astonishing when you think about it. A man who served as one of Washington's most important sources inside New York vanished back into history so completely that his secrecy outlived the war, outlived Washington, and outlived almost everyone who had known the danger firsthand. That is not a failure of the story. That is proof of the work. The best spies leave shadows, not monuments. But now, looking back, the shape of the network becomes clear enough to understand why it mattered. Start with a city the British believed they controlled. Place inside it a man who can listen. Move his information through ordinary channels. Carry it by road. Hide it with false names. Protect it with numbers. Conceal it with invisible ink. Signal the route from a clothesline. Move it across the Sound. Decode it. Deliver it to Washington. Then do it again, and again, and again, until the most powerful empire in the world is being watched by people it barely notices. That is the genius of the Culper Ring. It turned weakness into method. The Americans could not match British naval power in New York Harbor, so they used small boats. They could not openly occupy New York, so they occupied conversations. They could not protect spies with armies, so they protected them with secrecy. They could not defeat British power directly in the city, so they made the city leak. Every great empire fears the enemy army at the gates. But sometimes the more dangerous enemy is already inside the room, smiling politely, listening carefully, and remembering which regiment is leaving tomorrow. That is what Britain never saw coming. Not that Americans would fight. They knew Americans would fight. Not that Washington would retreat and survive. They had seen him do that. Not that France might enter the war. They understood that danger. What they did not fully grasp was that the rebellion had learned how to hide in plain sight. A farmer could be more dangerous than he looked. A merchant could be more than a merchant. A tavern keeper could carry more than business. A boatman could move more than passengers. A woman's laundry could be more than laundry. A blank page could be more than a blank page. And a number, 711, could mean George Washington. There is something almost poetic about that. The most famous man in the American Revolution, reduced to a code, protected by people whose own names nearly disappeared. Washington became 711 because secrecy demanded it. The spies became shadows because survival demanded it. And Britain, for all its power, could not crush what it could not clearly see. That is why the Culper Ring deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote. It was not the only intelligence network of the war. It did not single-handedly win independence. It did not replace the Continental Army, but it helped Washington do one of the hardest things in war. It helped him know enough to keep going, enough to avoid traps, enough to protect opportunities, enough to respond before it was too late, enough to survive. And survival was the first requirement of American independence. Before Yorktown, the army had to survive. Before victory, the alliance had to survive. Before the United States could exist, the idea had to survive long enough for the world to take it seriously. The Culpers helped buy that time. They did it without glory, without certainty, without safety, without knowing whether anyone would ever remember. That may be why their story matters now. Because history is often told as if only the loudest moments change the world. But sometimes the world changes because a man writes in invisible ink, because another man rides at night, because a boat crosses dark water, because a woman hangs a signal where everyone can see it and almost no one understands it, because an officer creates a codebook, because a commander knows that information can be as important as firepower. The British had uniforms. The Culpers had disguises. The British had headquarters. The Culpers had routes. The British had warships. The Culpers had whaleboats. The British had orders. The Culpers had whispers. The British had New York. Washington had eyes inside it. And sometimes that is enough to change the course of a war. So the next time the American Revolution is told only through battles, remember the other battlefield. The one without drums. The one without flags. The one that ran through taverns, farms, harbors, letters, numbers, and invisible ink. The one where a careless conversation could become a strategic warning. The one where a blank sheet of paper could carry a secret army of words. The one where ordinary people became the hidden nervous system of a revolution. Because while Britain watched Washington's army, Washington was watching Britain. And the empire never saw the watchers. That is what makes the Culper Ring so fascinating. It was not a story of one perfect hero. It was a story of a system, a farmer who was afraid but kept going, a merchant who listened but never revealed himself, a rider who made dangerous journeys look ordinary, a boatman who crossed dark water with British patrols nearby, a woman whose laundry may have carried more meaning than any soldier ever realized, and a commander who understood that sometimes the most important weapon in a war is not a musket, a cannon, or a bayonet. Sometimes it is information. So here is the question. If you were in Washington's position, surrounded by a stronger enemy, with your army outnumbered and your cause hanging by a thread, would you trust a hidden network of civilians with the future of the revolution? Or would you think the risk was too great? Because every person in the Culper Ring was one mistake away from the gallows. One intercepted letter. One suspicious neighbor. One British officer asking the right question. One courier searched at the wrong time. That was all it would have taken. And yet, for years, the network survived. Britain held New York, but Washington had eyes inside it. That is the kind of story history often hides in the margins. Not because it did not matter, but because the people who did it were never supposed to be seen. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe, because this channel is about the hidden decisions, impossible gambles, forgotten tactics, and quiet acts of courage that changed military history. and I want to hear your take in the comments. Was the Culper Ring one of the most underrated intelligence networks in history? Or is there another spy operation, battlefield trick, or impossible deception you think deserves its own episode? Drop it below, because the best stories in history are often the ones most people were never taught. And in the next episode, we are going from the shadows of New York to one of the bloodiest lessons Britain learned in the early days of the Revolution. A battle Britain technically won, but paid for so badly that victory almost looked like defeat. Because sometimes the most important battle in a war is the one nobody sees. And sometimes even the battles everyone sees are not won by the side that survives the field.